Thank you for speaking with me, Professor Savage. Would you begin by saying what interested you so much in the political career of Seán Lemass?
I've focused most of my research on 20th century Ireland, and especially the post-war period. And Seán Lemass is one of these iconic figures that sometimes has been overlooked and overshadowed by people such as Eamon de Valera or Michael Collins. Lemass is not the romantic character that Michael Collins has been presented to be, and he's not somebody that was the towering figure that Eamon de Valera was through much of 20th century Ireland. Yet he's an intriguing character. He's somebody that had a long political career that was quite distinguished, and he was able to change his mind and make a number of very courageous decisions later in his career, especially when he became Taoiseach or Prime Minister in 1959. When he became Prime Minister, he understood that it was imperative to develop economic policies that would enable Ireland to stem the flow of emigration. I think one of the real concerns he had as Prime Minister was that there were hundreds of thousands of people leaving Ireland. It's been estimated that from the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945 and up until 1960, upwards of 500,000 young men and women left Ireland, mostly for the United Kingdom in search of work. And for him, this was an embarrassment and a scathing verdict on the failure of Irish governments to provide opportunities for young people. And I've always been interested in the way he was willing to put aside previous economic policies and engage in policies that required a bit of risk. He was a convert to Keynesian economic philosophy and understood that unless the government took risks, that the economy simply would continue to stagnate.
So what was Lemass's approach to the economic and emigration crises of the mid-century?
It's a good question, and it's what got me interested in Lemass in the first place. Lemass was one of the founding members of a political party known as Fianna Fail, a party that really dominated 20th century Ireland. And when this government was elected in 1932, it embraced an economic policy of protectionism. It believed in what was known as autarky and self-sufficiency. And Lemass was Minister of Commerce, somebody that was determined to build up tariff walls to protect native industry. And from the early days, from the early 1930s, as Minister of Industry and Commerce, he was interested in trying to prevent foreign investment in Ireland. He believed that foreign investment could complicate the efforts of this new government to chart its own independent course. He believed that if foreign industrialists owned a significant number of factories in Ireland, that they would have undue influence on policy inside of Ireland. So he was interested in helping nurture the development of native industries. And he believed the best way to do this was to put up high tariff walls that would make goods that would be imported into Ireland from mostly Great Britain, make those too expensive for people. What he wanted to do was to encourage the development of native industry. And he believed that by protecting native industry, that they could gain traction and produce quality goods for an Irish market. However, these policies that were put in place in the 1930s had some success, but by the time he became Prime Minister in 1959, he understood that they were no longer working. In fact, in the middle of the 1950s, he had become a convert to Keynesian economics, and he believed it was imperative for the government to initiate a number of projects that would improve the infrastructure of the country. He believed that it was imperative that the government take risk and borrow money carefully to invest and to encourage foreign investment. So this was a real shift. He had gone from endorsing protectionist policies to encouraging foreign investment. He had understood by the mid-1950s that it was important to encourage foreign investment. He wanted, especially American investment, to come into Ireland, and believed that this was the best route for the Irish economy. He wanted to build an export-orientated economy that would focus on producing for a European market.
What were Lemass's politics towards Northern Ireland?
On Northern Ireland, Lemass had traditionally had a hostile view and failed or refused to recognize the Northern Irish state as legitimate. Now, this was Fianna Fail policy from the early 1930s. The party argued that Ireland was partitioned by the British, that the British should facilitate the reunification of Northern Ireland with what became the Irish Republic. Lemass understood that it was imperative to initiate a dialogue with Belfast, and therefore he began to make a number of gestures to the Prime Minister in Northern Ireland, who initially was not interested. Lord Brookerbrough was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland when Lemass became Taoiseach, or Prime Minister himself, in 1959. And Brookerbrough was not somebody that was interested in any kind of dialogue with the Republic of Ireland. He regarded the Republic's claim on the 6 counties of Northern Ireland as aggressive and irredentist, and wanted formal recognition from Dublin of Northern Ireland and its parliament. Now, this was something that no Fianna Fail government could really do, but Lemass wanted to engage with Belfast, and he succeeded in doing this beginning in 1963 when Terence O'Neill became Prime Minister in Northern Ireland. O'Neill was somebody who was a modernizer, much like Lemass, and O'Neill was cautious but wanted to build bridges within Northern Ireland and also improve relations with Dublin. The fact of the matter is that before Lemass became Taoiseach in 1959, there was no dialogue at all between Belfast and Dublin. Dublin refused to recognize Northern Ireland as legitimate. It complained to London about partition. And Lemass understood that these policies had failed. And what he wanted to do was to engage with leaders in Northern Ireland. And for Lemass, it was all about economics. And he believed that he could encourage politicians in Northern Ireland to develop economic policies that would benefit both jurisdictions. So his policy towards Northern Ireland was a break from the past. It was an effort to at least begin a conversation with Belfast. And this is something that saw a degree of success. By 1965, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Terence O'Neill, realized that it made sense to facilitate a dialogue with Lemass, and invited Seán Lemass to Belfast, to the Parliament at Stormont, for talks. These talks introduced a thaw in relations between the North and the Irish Republic.
And why was Lemass so committed to improving relations with Britain?
Well, again, it comes back to economics. Lemass was interested in trying to improve the Irish economy. He was embarrassed by the high levels of immigration that continued to plague Ireland throughout the post-war period. And he believed that by improving relations with London, that he could encourage the establishment of a free trade area. What Lemass wanted to do was to develop a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom that would enable the free movement of goods and services throughout the British Isles. He believed that that would help improve the Irish economy. And again, he was focused on trying to enable industries to develop in Ireland. And by 1959, when he became Taoiseach, he was interested in foreign investment. He was looking for investment from the United States, but also from the United Kingdom. He also understood that in the future, it would be important for Ireland to develop a export-oriented economy that would be focused on Europe. And he believed that it was in the interest of both Dublin and London to have a free trade area, and that this would enable both countries to enter into what was then the European Economic Community more easily. He was also interested in developing cordial relations with London because he needed London's support to encourage Northern Ireland and the prime ministers in Northern Ireland to engage in dialogue with him. And so he was very careful in trying to engage with prime ministers in both the Labour as well as the Conservative parties to encourage them to facilitate dialogue between Belfast and Dublin. And from London's perspective, they appreciated Lemass. They looked at Lemass and saw somebody that they could work with. They had been working with de Valera over decades and believed de Valera was a rather difficult character to work with. In Lemass, they saw somebody who was pragmatic, who was interested in economic development, who was somebody they could work with. They understood that Lemass was not the ideologue that Eamon de Valera was and appreciated that. And they also wanted Belfast to engage in conversations with Dublin. They wanted to see relations between those two parts of Ireland improve. And so British politicians and civil servants in both the office of the Prime Minister as well as in the Foreign and Colonial Office looked at Lemass and saw somebody that could improve the relationships between London, Belfast, and Dublin, and again supported Lemass in his efforts to improve relations throughout these islands.
How did Lemass navigate the delicate relationship between politics and the church?
It's a very good question. Early on in his career, Lemass was somebody that criticized the church for its support of Cumann Gael, which was the pro-treaty party, the party that had accepted the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty that established the Irish Free State. He denounced the influence of the church in Irish politics in the 1920s and into the early 1930s. But by the time he became a minister, he understood that it was important to work with the Catholic Church. He was somebody that understood that maintaining political power was the most important thing for Fianna Fail. And so he worked hard not to alienate the church. Now, this created problems for him. For instance, in the 1950s, he supported a health bill that ran into opposition from the church. He negotiated with the church. He had to make compromises with the church. He might not have liked the compromises that he made, but he understood the political reality of Ireland in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Ireland was a conservative country where the church had a tremendous amount of influence. And many church leaders, especially the Archbishop of Dublin, a man named John Charles McQuaid, was not afraid to use the power that he had to try and influence government policy. Now, Lemass, into the 1960s, and this was partly in an effort to improve relations with Belfast and also with London, Lemass made an effort to try and change the Irish Constitution that had been developed by his predecessor, Eamon de Valera, in 1937. The Constitution contained language that Lemass found that Lemass understood Protestants were uncomfortable with. And he established a constitutional committee that was formed to try and change language in the Constitution that would make it more palatable for Protestants. Again, he was somebody that was interested in engaging with Belfast, but also with Protestants inside of Ireland. And he understood that many Protestants regarded the Constitution as containing language that was overtly Catholic and made non-Catholics uncomfortable. And therefore, he made a concerted effort to adjust the Constitution to make it something that was less sectarian and was something that would recognize the Protestant population in Ireland and make them feel more comfortable in what was the Irish Republic. Lemass was successful. He he again established this constitutional committee to look at the 1937 Constitution, and he was a member of that committee. He understood that real changes had to be made and was supportive of language that made the Constitution more inclusive. He understood that there was much more work to be done, but importantly, he began a process of trying to reach out and engage with Protestants in Ireland to make them feel more comfortable with the Constitution and with their place in Irish society.
It was fascinating in the internet era to read about the concerns and debate around the creation of either a public or private television service in Ireland. What was Lemass's role?
Well, he played a critical role. Television came to Ireland very late. Ireland was one of the last countries in Europe to have its own indigenous service. And in the 1950s, there were debates within the government about what type of television service should be established. There were those who wanted to follow the model of the American networks and have private companies be licensed to begin broadcasting in Ireland. There were others who argued that television was a very important medium, and that the Irish should follow the example of the British and adopt a public service television, much like the BBC. Lemass was ambivalent. He was somebody that was interested in economic development, and he did not want to invest heavily in a public service television station. And therefore, he was not all that supportive of those that advocated public service broadcasting for Ireland. But in the end, he compromised and accepted that there should be a state authority that would operate a commercial public service. That is, a public service that would be funded by license fees, as well as commercials that would be broadcast in between individual television shows. He was somebody that understood that television was inevitable. He believed that television would help open up and modernize Irish society. But he was also concerned about the television service as it evolved. He didn't necessarily like the current affairs programming that he saw. He didn't like the fact that news and current affairs programming was oftentimes critical of policies that he was developing. And he hoped that he'd have more power to shape or control Irish television broadcasting. And this was futile. He couldn't really control news and public affairs broadcasting, and this made him really uncomfortable. But modernization was a two-edged sword. Again, he was interested in opening up Irish society and encouraging foreign investment and encouraging modern telecommunications. But television could be critical of policies that he was developing, and he resented that and complained bitterly on a number of occasions about broadcasts that he found unfair and that highlighted economic policies that were not particularly successful.
Is there anything else you want to say about writing this biography?
I was interested in writing this biography about Seán Lemass because I think he's a pivotal character in 20th century Ireland. He's somebody that had the courage to make decisions that were unpopular. He's also somebody that was focused on economic development. He understood that emigration was indicative of failures that that had plagued Irish governments throughout this period. And he was willing to take risks to encourage foreign investment. He understood that it was imperative to develop a working class that would be strong, and he also wanted to see a middle class develop inside of Ireland, a middle class that could, and a working class that would have a future in Ireland. He was embarrassed by the high numbers of young people that were leaving the country in search of work, and believed that for Ireland to live up to the ideals and the expectations of its founders, that Ireland had to make a number of decisions that would involve risks, that it had to borrow to improve infrastructure. And it had to have improved infrastructure, improved roads and telecommunications, harbors and ports to encourage foreign investment. And these were all decisions that were controversial at the time. He had the courage of his convictions and made decisions that were unpopular, but in the end enabled Ireland to enjoy a degree of economic growth. He was fortunate in that he became prime minister at a time when Western economies were expanding. And as the saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, Lemass, I think, deserves the reputation of Ireland's great modernizer. He put in place policies that enabled Ireland to take advantage of the expansion of the worldwide economies in the 1960s. And for that reason, I believe he is a very important, if not critical, political leader in post-war Ireland.